Right then, so we're going to look at organisational culture now. And I think it's clear that we focus on organisational culture as culture comes in many different forms. There's national cultures, macro cultures, organisational cultures with subcultures in them, and then micro cultures, pockets in those organisational subcultures. So we'll look at organisational culture. A lot has been written about culture from an organisational perspective. And a lot of it is based around what large corporations have started to tackle and how they've started to look at their cultures. And a lot of it is very theoretical, and it's only the visual bits that we see, and they're the bits that the organisations want to promote, they want to publicise. However, it's a little bit deeper than that and can make a massive difference on, as we've talked about in leadership, those things can either go with the culture or set the culture, and we'll look at how those sort of things develop. But first of all, we'll start to look at what is and what do we think culture, organisational culture, is about. So, as we said, there's been a lot written about organisational culture, and it's not simple because there's a lot of opinions about what it is. But one of the major books, a classic book, was by Edgar Schein, and that was Organisational Culture and Leadership. He drew a lot of information from sociologists, from anthropologists, from social and organisational behaviour examples, and in his book he described it as a pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration, a product of joint learning. Quite wordy that, and I don't know, but we'll come back to that, whether you like it, whether it feels a comfortable description of it, and you'll really have to come up with your own. But he said that it was also split into 3 levels. The 3 levels were the visible, so the offices, the buildings, the signs, the products, the visual persona that was created by the organisation that they broadcast to everybody, the espoused or adopted beliefs and values, and then he said there were the underlying assumptions, the things taken for granted, that were the things that just happened, the things that were assumed. I prefer it when he later on said that it was like the character of an individual, and that's more something that I can connect with. And someone once said to me, and I don't know who it was, that culture was just the way we do things around here. And when I had my own business, me and my business partner sat down quite a lot of times and talked about the words we use and the different sort of things we were talking about that were basically about the organisational culture. And when we had a team of 3 or 4 that were close, that we all knew, it was very easy to determine what the culture was and to keep it. But as it expanded, we had to talk about what the visual image, what the values that we were promoting. And when you start getting 5, 10, 15 staff, it becomes harder and harder for those espoused or underlying assumptions to just happen. And we had to sit down and write a set of values and get everyone involved. Otherwise, we felt that that was just going to disappear. So the bigger it gets and the harder it gets to maintain that culture and make sure that it is being an effective sort of tool in making sure everybody's comfortable with where you're going. Another popular take on culture was from Charles Handy. His theories have had a powerful impact on modern management thinking and the views of organisational development, and they've helped bring a more humanitarian sort of perspective to leadership and management. He proposed that there were 4 culture types, each an individual culture stemming from different human motivations, thoughts, learning, as well as a different assumed bias for the power and influence in that culture. We'll take a look at those individually now. His types were power, role, task, and person-centered culture. So in Handy's power culture, power is held by the very few. In fact, sometimes just one individual. They have a massive influence over the organisation. There are few rules and regulations because the power and all the decisions are made by that one person. Employees are generally judged on what they achieve and their outcomes rather than how they do it or how they act. The consequences of it can be very quick decision making because only one person is involved and they've just got to make it. But those decisions aren't sometimes in the best interest of the organisation. Power cultures are seen as very strong and often stable, but that can swiftly turn toxic. A lot of what happened when the banks collapsed and Lehman Brothers is put down to the strong power culture that was in those sort of organisations. Handy's role culture is based on responsibilities, strong functional departmental roles, as can be seen from the organisational chart in the picture. Very, very power and authority led, key with strong rules, procedures and processes, can be quite bureaucratic, and very, very sort of similar to what you would perhaps think of in the forces or the NHS. So Handy's task culture was about teams in organisations, sometimes formed for specific problems or to do specific roles. The task is the important thing, so power is with the team and will shift depending on the mix or expertise of the team members and sometimes the status of the problem or project. Whether the task culture proves effective is determined by the dynamics in those teams, so the skills mix and personalities and the leadership. If they're right, it can be a real strong working environment, very productive and creative. In Handy's person-centered culture, individuals very much see themselves as unique and superior to the rest of the organisation. The organisation is simply a medium for them to apply their trade. The organisation with a person-centered culture is really just a collection of individuals sharing little but working for the same organisation under the same roof. Very often in the sort of professions as lawyers, accountants, or maybe city traders, where people feel that their expertise is the key to the organisation. So Terence Steele and Alan Kennedy were one of the first to propose the sort of idea of corporate culture in those words. They had a book, Corporate Culture, The Rites and Rituals of Corporate Life, which is in your reading list, came out in the early 80s. It's been updated since, but they proposed that corporate culture was the thing. And a lot of people thought it would be a passing fad. And as I mentioned earlier, it's grown into a massive phrase or notion and is embedded within business terminology now. They based their theory on a set that there were 6 cultural elements. The first was history, and they said that was the narrative that sort of put in place the foundations of the culture. So it was the traditions and what had gone on in that company and what they stood for. The next was values and beliefs, and they believed this identified what the shared beliefs were and what was really important and the values that determine what the organisation stands for. And we'll look and expand on that in a bit more because that's sort of developed. The next was rituals and ceremonies, and these are the things that employees do every day, the things that go on in the company every day. And it could include things like Friday afternoon get-togethers, everyone saying good morning to the manager in the morning. It could be anything, but the common things that go on within the company and build the culture. The next was the cultural network, and that was the information that the organisation had learned, what described what was going on, how things sort of got passed around. And there'd be different people. There'd be people who told stories of the past. There'd be gossipers who were bringing current events to everybody. People with Deal and Kennedy talked about there being spies who were working for the manager, but all these things were the network that was within the company and affected it. The next was heroic figures, and that was about stories about employees who'd done fantastic things in the past. It may have been a past manager or someone who acted as a role model, and quite often these stories are flowered and expanded, but those set a culture of what goes in the organisation. And like I said, those stories, the final one, are the things that get passed around about the past exploits and what we've got to live up to. And all these things, they said, built into setting what the culture was. But just quickly before we move on, I want to focus on one of those in particular, and that's values and beliefs, because it's made up of a number of areas. As you can see there on the slide, there's company values and individual values, and we're going to talk more about those in session 3 when we focus on them. And then the top one there, British values, and we'll expand on them in the next slide. So as part of the PREVENT strategy, that's the government strategy designed to support people at risk of joining extremist groups, carrying out terrorist activities, being radicalised, you'll get a chance to, or have already completed some training on that. But as part of that strategy, British values were identified, and they are becoming widely accepted as a fundamental part of people management. They reflect the fundamental British values in modern Britain, and they're the sort of minimum things that your employees will expect. These values were identified as democracy, rule of law, respect and tolerance, and individual liberty. What they said was these things underpin what it is to be a citizen in a modern, diverse Great Britain, and they're about valuing the community and celebrating diversity in the UK. And part of being a citizen is, for a large proportion of the population, working. So that's your workforce we're talking about. These fundamental values are not exclusive to the British people. They're common to many democratic countries, and they're key to creating and defining orderly society. And that can be at work. They make members feel safe, they make them feel protected and valued so that they can contribute to the good themselves and for others. The principle of these values impacts on all areas of leading people, managing people, not just equality, diversity and inclusion, and we'll look at that. So they're not just for PREVENT, although that's where they came from. They fit into leading people, leadership and culture, and we'll look at how we embed them into leadership and leading people in this session. And we'll also then, as we go through the qualification, highlight them where they become relevant. So democracy, about building a culture upon freedom and equality where everyone has their rights and responsibilities. So specifically, sort of areas in the workplace that it's going to impact on are showing leadership and accountability, allowing joint decision making, that's that sort of democracy side, having regular team meetings where staff feel they've got freedom, ensuring their right to protest and to petition, and making sure that we're giving and receiving feedback. That fits into that democracy. That's going to have a massive influence on the organisational culture. If it's not there, if those things aren't there, it starts to be eroded, people feel undermined, and your choice in the way you decide to lead people, the style you use, can have a massive impact. So rule of law. People need rules to make them feel happy, safe. We might not think that, but we need boundaries. We need to feel happy, safe, and in a secure environment for us both to live and work. And again, areas that it can particularly have an impact on in the workplace are ensuring that legislation is there and applied, the key being that it's applied, setting out and keeping agreed working practices, policies and procedures so people know where they stand, ensuring that the laws to protect you and protect others are in place, and having and maintaining codes of conduct. Make people feel secure. So your style of leadership can have an influence, and the organisational culture will have an influence. In particular, in this area, in the equality, diversity and inclusion, which we're going to look at in session 4. It causes staff, if they don't feel these things are there, that the rule of law is being applied, staff start to feel unhappy, they start to feel disadvantaged. So moving on, respect and tolerance. Understanding that they won't be blamed, that there's a shared belief and values, respecting people's values, ideas and beliefs while not imposing too much of your own on people. Specific areas in the workplace are embracing that diversity, and we're going to talk more about that in session 4. Recognizing the importance of people's traditions, religions, cultural heritage and their preferences. Not stereotyping people, not labelling them and therefore prejudicing them, and where discrimination comes up, tackling it. So your approach to the way you meet the organisational culture, the behaviours that you display, can have a massive impact in this area of respect and tolerance. You need to set an example so that people feel comfortable. And the final one, individual liberty, sort of brings them all together in some respects, but it's a protection of your rights and the rights of others that you work with. Specifically in the workplace, it'll be things like equality and the Human Rights Act, making sure that we're offering personal development to people, that's individualizing them, ensuring that they're given respect and dignity in our interactions with them, making sure that we're offering the right choices, the right consent and individuality, and that where we've put values and principles in place, we're meeting them. So the impact from this can be massive on their motivation, the way you lead and the culture you set, treating people as individuals and recognizing their diversity is going to have a massive impact on their individual liberty. And all these things go towards setting that culture of a nice place to work where you feel valued and where everything feels good. And I've mentioned that word feels before when we talk about the culture. So let's move on to start looking at the impact of the culture. So after looking at a couple of models to sort of start rounding up, the culture in an organization has a major impact in defining how people interact, how they approach their work. And it can therefore dictate the way we have to lead our behaviors and the styles we use. The factors can have an enabling factor or a suppressing factor, as the graphic suggests. And it's a case of getting a balance between the two. These factors link in, as we said, with the Tannenbaum and Schmidt leadership continuum and how we have to vary our leadership style depending on the situation. So enabling factors are the culture gives empowerment, it enables people to be creative and participative. And then the suppressing sort of factors, if the culture is wrong, is it can be too controlling, too formal, very process driven. It's very power or role based, and these can make people feel that they're being undermined and they're not free to express themselves. And on the enabling side, it makes them feel empowered, that they want to work for the organization. And as we've mentioned, and as we will look at more in motivation, sometimes it's about making those people feel that they want to work for the organization rather than they have to work for the organization. So we have organizational culture, but many factors can influence an organization's culture, and it also depends on the situation the organization's in. Is it a settled, established company? Is it a new start? Is there a takeover in the making? And the sector you're in, is it a fast-changing sector? Is it a steady sector? But all of them can really be split into two sort of key areas, and that's external, where we're talking about things such as social factors, changes in the fabric of society, fads, fashions, something becoming more popular or unpopular. Economic factors, changes in people's incomes, the level of employment, how the country is doing, immigration levels, for example. And then technological, things changing due to advances. Internet shopping was a big one, for example, or more people being able to work from home due to advances in technology or new automations in processes for production. And then legal, changes in the law and legislation. They could be across the country, for example, health and safety regulations, or when the smoking ban came in, or specific to a sector, a change in respect of a product or a service. And then there's the internal ones, which we have more power on because we don't really have any power over the external ones. They're imposed on us, but the internal ones, such as the structure, the hierarchy, and the reporting structures we have within the organization, are they clear? Communication, is there a clear, open communication style and mechanisms for people to use those structures? Are there role models for people to look at? Have we got them? Do they act in line with what the organizational culture? Do they display the desired attitudes and beliefs that we're trying to embed? And then there's the individuals within the organization, because they change, and when they change, their values and their beliefs change, and they bring different ones, as we talked about in the Deal and Kennedy model just. And then what training have we got in place? Have we got development programs in place to support people to embed those correct traits and skills that we want? And are we developing leaders and leadership styles to support the culture? So it's quite a lot of aspects to consider, and leadership styles, individual employees, and factors that impact on the culture. Getting that balance right between those can be difficult, and there can be clashes with staff who are highly motivated or unmotivated, creative staff, self-determined people, highly skilled people. In those sort of people, say, in a role or a power-based culture, which is very regimented and restricted, are going to add to those things. So it's a real balancing act. So next we're going to watch a short video about culture and change management and a survey that was completed by Strategy and then in the part 4 PowerPoint we will examine some of the key outcomes of that survey and look at culture and change and how it interacts. So watch the video and then the PowerPoint. Thanks.